because then you cannot accommodate relative price changes, because it is very difficult for the nominal price to go down and the firm would again produce. It creates a problem. And it also increases your debt burden if there is a deflation. You can inflate your way out of a debt. You cannot do that in case of a deflation. The burden becomes very high. The economy doesn't grow. So it creates all kinds of problem. So then you would have to have a little bit of inflation. But if you have too much of inflation, then it is a big problem. But that process broke down. Then we transited to something called the multiple indicator approach. But now what we are doing is a flexible inflation targeting, because that is what is coming out as the best practice monetary policy. So what is our objective there? That you have a consumer price inflation of 4% plus minus 2%. You'll ask, why plus minus 2%? Because this is a developing economy. 50% of your consumer price basket, as you know, food and fuel-related products, because these are subject to supply shocks. Because Reserve Bank cannot control the food prices. So now see, monsoon rains are not there. Because Manipal, because we see that August, all the time it rains, but this time today only because I came it rained, because I was told earlier it was not raining. So then it becomes a problem, because so then it impacts food prices in that process. So to accommodate supply shock, we have given a band, say 2 plus minus 2%. Because if it is through supply shock, then you look through, you don't respond to that. You look through that number. So this gives the kind of flexibility. But if you have a numerical target, then you can hold the central bank accountable. And if we cannot meet that target, then we write to the letter to the government, we put in the public domain that why we are not able to meet that particular kind of a target. And many countries, it happens, the central bank governor gets fired. For example, you take an example of New Zealand. If the central bank is not able to maintain that target for a couple of years, the governor is fired. On that way, he loses his job. And then there is a lot of criticism that India is going into inflation targeting. Then you say that you guys were doing financial stability, and have you forgotten that? Now you are going in for inflation targeting. Actually, the world is turning towards more multiple indicator approach, because their financial sector is a problem. So they are moving away from single objective, single target, and we are going towards that. So then there are a lot of criticism, and but the context is important. So then I'll show you, just following this, that how the context is important, and but it should be, because inflation targeting doesn't mean that you are inflation nutter, because then you would have to see, and the target is met over a medium term, the way you would define 3 years and 5 years within that horizon. It is not that every time that I am maintaining that 4%. Over a medium term, that you would have to meet that inflation objective. And while meeting that, it gives you adequate flexibility, because if there is a problem because of financial crisis, I would have to change the interest rate or maybe accept a little bit of more inflation. Can I do it? Certainly I can do it within the flexible inflation targeting framework. Because given this criticism, this framework also has learned. Because initially, the way New Zealand and Bank of England, the way they started inflation targeting, the conditions are much more tough. But they have also relaxed, learning from experience, their position. And their relaxation, because accommodation from the way it happens. In different theories, there is a give and take, then you come out with the best possible approach. So what is the context? There are a lot of discussion. You would see this is WPI, this is CPI, and then all those things are happening. You see 2003 to 2008, there are 3 inflation indicators I have shown here. The blue bar would be the consumer price index, which we are going to target now. The red one is the wholesale price index, and the green one is the GDP deflator. People will say, no, consumer price is not the appropriate indicator. Somebody say wholesale price, these are commodity and all that, not the appropriate. Somebody say that you do GDP deflator, GDP in the entire price basket. You would recall that 2003 2008 was a very high growth phase. India was also in that kind of great moderation growth was growing 8.5 to 9%, we are growing at breakneck speed. Inflation was also not an issue. Actually, CPI inflation at 5% was lower than WPI inflation, because that time Reserve Bank was focusing more on the WPI inflation. And empirically and theoretically, that we had seen that WPI CPI tend to converge. There could be lead and lag relationship, they used to converge. And the GDP deflator is also more or less at the WPI inflation. There was no issue. As I say, moderate inflation, you can always define 5%, that was not an issue. But following the global financial crisis, then for the 6th year that we saw, then the CPI inflation became double digit, unbearable. And even the WPI inflation and all that became 7-8%, that as you could see. So high inflation. See, once that happens, then you see that a patient has a particular kind of disease, you try the conventional medicine. Different thing would be there. No, it is from supply side, because the oil prices went over the roof from $50 a barrel to at one point $160 a barrel. And we are a major oil importer, so we cannot help it. Then you say that we have drought, so food prices have gone up. So tolerate a little bit of inflation, it is supply side, Reserve Bank cannot do. So obviously, but beyond a point, it's not going to cut ice, because then your credibility is lost. Then people will question what the Reserve Bank is doing, what the government is doing. They're not able to hold the price line for such a long period of time. For a temporary period, you can have excuses, you can do this. Then obviously, given that situation, you would have to look into your own framework, that whether my framework is working or not working. So that is how the inflation targeting framework came, because with the experience that many countries facing, of course, it is not a very high inflation, because a little higher inflation, they have succeeded in anchoring inflation expectation. But it's very difficult for one to really explain to the public, what is this inflation expectation? Can I see it? You don't, it's very difficult to convey, even to learned economists, that you say that, oh, I'm doing that to anchor inflation expectation. A simple example looking at inflation expectation. Suppose it would have been 3-4 years back, your maid servant comes home and then asks for a raise. So your parents should be more likely to grant them the raise, because you see everywhere the prices are going up. Then they will say how this poor lady would survive. They cannot survive. You not haggle with them. But once that means your expectation, if you start looking at inflation for over a period of time, your expectation also goes high. See, and suppose you buy a meal in your canteen, which was 50 rupees, and next semester you come, it becomes 60 rupees. If your expectation is raised, you don't raise an eyebrow, it is a normal thing. The mindset gets on that basis. But if it is not, then you will question. I said that it was 50 rupees, why it became 60 rupees? Before this crisis, suddenly US had an inflation. I was there during that time. Then the younger generation, they have not seen inflation in US. You get a pocket money, you go to McDonald's or Burger King, you buy, it's $3.25. If they ask you for $3.50, you don't have that money. And youngsters cannot figure out how this price can really go up. It is difficult to explain, but this is how it is. Those who have lived through inflation, they know what it is. Those who have not seen inflation, they cannot know, because their expectations are really, really well anchored in that process. So what did the restaurant do? They reduced the quantity. Of course, it's a good thing, given the overweight problem in the US, it helped, it perhaps should have helped the citizen there. But that is how the market adjusted to higher inflation. Of course, that is behind us. So that is how. If inflation gets raised and gets set in our mind, it becomes very difficult really to fight that inflation. So that is how we came out with this inflation targeting framework to anchor expectation. And as you see that we have started getting results, 2014-15, CPI has dropped to 6.4%. And if you see 15-16 data are there up to July, and then you see that it has come down to 4.8%. And if somebody is looking at WPI, then you say we are in disinflation because WPI is in negative. Because WPI, as you know, it has overload of commodities, and oil prices are going down, commodity prices are going down, so it is becoming negative. Of course, the Reserve Bank cannot take the entire credit for that. Obviously, it is with luck, because as you know, the oil price is currently below $50 a barrel. So with good luck and with good policy, hopefully that we would succeed on that process. And our objective again is to, going forward from 16, 17, it would be, this is a glide path that we have set. And from 16, 17, we'll have 4% plus minus 2%. That is the kind of inflation that we'll have. So what is the kind of policy framework? As I said in the beginning of my lecture, that you have this dilemma, that you do multiple, because see, multiple objective to control that you need multiple instrument. So you cannot, through one instrument, you cannot do multiple things. So then what is the best policy framework that what is coming out? That monetary policy, it should be a flexible inflation targeting. That is the wisdom now where we are moving. And financial stability, that you do more macroprudential policy. Because basically you would see that what is emphasized by the G20, Financial Stability Board and all those bases that we are putting in. The capital requirement under the Basel III capital requirement, that you would have to put more capital. Because if you see that the big conglomerate in the financial sector, the TLAC, total loss absorbency capacity. What is the backlash in the West? Because it's the public money, again, is being put to bail out the Wall Street, isn't it? And if you see, because if there is a financial crisis, your real economy also gets into kind of a depression. That is what we are seeing, because the Western world is struggling to raise its growth rate. So also is happening in Japan, because they had the financial crisis in the 90s, and they're still not able to come out of that. But public doesn't understand. Public says that it is a taxpayer money should not be put. So that is how the regulation. Somebody asked me the question. So regulation is coming back again. That if it is a bank, it's a corporate, you should have a living will. It is the shareholders' money which should be put on the table. If I'm playing with somebody else's money, I would be careless. This is the debt equity balance. So you bring in more equity in that process. So the resolution of financial entity can happen with the shareholders' money rather than going into the taxpayers' money. So that is the kind of thing it is coming up. And what do you do? That if you see risk in the system, I don't know how is the real estate prices in Manipal, but you see that it is, so house prices are going up and all that, India is going up, things like that. Now, how do you control it? So then you bring in macroprudential, kind of a loan to value ratio that you can put it, you can raise risk weight. So India actually is a pioneer in this regard to bring in macroprudential policies. When we did, then we saw that there's a lot of increase in real estate prices and all that when Dr. Reddy was our governor. But we didn't have a great model or something to work with that. But then we saw something doesn't smell good. It's not right. We brought in this policy that we put risk weight, that if you're doing lending to high value houses, luxury houses and all that, you bring in risk weight, because we don't have any control over corporates or households and things like that, but we have control over bank. We say, okay, you bring in risk weight of 150%. Then, of course, bankers are naturally unhappy. Even international fora, they were saying, what are you talking? How can you put a risk weight of 150%? But that has become mainstream and known by the jargon as macroprudential. So, a lot of things that really you would have to do that. But is it a clear-cut distinction? Perhaps not, isn't it? Because there is a nexus between financial stability and monetary policy through asset price channel, isn't it? Because if your asset price goes up, your collateral value goes up. To that extent, you can borrow more from the banking sector. So that you have opened up a lot of capital inflows coming, a lot of money coming, your asset prices go up. Because, food prices will not go up. You come to a particular level. You are having 1 meal, you force yourself, will have 1.5 meal. But you cannot have 4 meals a day. So it will not go up. But you can buy. You can buy a condo here, you can buy a luxury house here, you can buy in other places, and all the asset prices will go up. And once you get asset prices, you put it as a collateral to our banking friend, they would be happy to loan you on that basis. So there is a nexus. And also the risk-taking channel. So what happens? That if I see that interest rate the way as you see in Western countries, interest rates are zero, isn't it? And in some countries, that even theory, what you read in the textbook, I don't know whether your textbook have changed, but you see that people say that, this zero lower bound, you cannot, nominal interest rate, you cannot go below zero. But that is proved wrong, isn't it? If you say Swiss National Bank in Sweden, if you go to a bank, put money, there is a negative interest rate. You put 100 rupees, there is 1% negative interest rate. Tomorrow you'll get 99 rupees. So that is also coming into practice. Still people putting money, that much is there. So when money, it's opportunity cost, isn't it? Interest rate is what is the opportunity cost for holding money. So if it is not there, so you will take more risk. Free money is available everywhere it is there, then you take the risk-taking channel. So once you do that, then the asset prices go up, other thing, you take all kinds of risk which is not viable. So rather than university, then you say, no, it is not very profitable. Students are not giving good fees and all that. I'll put a casino in some hill in Manipal. You will invest in different kinds of things. So the risk-taking channel, then it again affects the system. Now the question, that if it is price stability, so then what is your instrument through which you achieve? Is through interest rate. So these are questions, I don't have answers because you are bright students, I am posing question to you. So can monetary policy lean against the wind? The doctrine, the belief during Alan Greenspan's era of central banking was that central bank can clean, it cannot lean. Okay, that you have asset price bubble, you don't have the tools really to know that is it a bubble? No, I don't know perhaps. Stock market, is it a bubble or it's not a bubble? But we know that these bubbles also develop and they burst. Then they say once the bubble bursts, you do the cleanup job. So that is how the central bank step in LOLR, this, that, and all that kind of a thing. So now the question that if you're seeing that things are not good, can you lean against the wind? Can you try to prick the bubble somewhere? These are the thought process which are coming globally and are being discussed. And then the other area where a lot of work is going on is the institutional design, because you have to have the institution really to respond. See, Western countries, when it happened, so there was no institution to respond because things had got fragmented. See, from where we originate, Bank of England, because earlier you see that financial supervision, regulation, and monetary policy are together, but they separated it out. No sooner you have done, you lose your skills because you don't know this kind of a thing which is there. When financial crisis struck, because I was in the International Monetary Fund, and the International Monetary Fund went through a restructuring process. They sent a lot of people home. Because that time was the talk that IMF is not required. Should we close down IMF? That was the big debate just before 2008. And post-crisis, people say, oh, we need IMF and a bigger IMF and things. So how things change so quickly? When that was happening, they were sending out people home, because I was in an HR conference and all those kind of a thing that you see that people who are the good chaps are there, they got some other market jobs, they're moving out. But then crisis strike, then you don't have the skills and expertise really to handle and understand that what you should be doing on that. So you need to have a better institutional design for coordination. So obviously, as I said, FSDC, that we have government which is chairing. So also in different jurisdictions, the politics again comes in. So obviously there's a trade-off, isn't it? Because independent and accountability, because central banks are not political institutions. Central banks are technical institutions. And so they have been enjoined given a particular task. So then you say that you keep distance from politics. That was the wisdom. But now with this, what is happening? Please don't quote me, that we are in the laps of politicians. Isn't it? We are coming back, central bank and government, they're coming back. So there are trade-offs. I'm saying there's no other option. I'm saying, okay, central bank cannot have exclusive exclusive role. It may have a lead role because we have a broad gamut of financial markets, but it has to be a collective responsibility. So where to draw the line? So that's a big tension that one really would have to go through. And it creates problem in terms of communication challenges, that if you're doing something, you raise interest rate. Did you do it for the objective of price stability, or did you do it for financial stability objective? If it's a single objective, it is very clear. Everybody can transparently see it. Yes, somebody with a primary school degree also can make out that this is what has happened. This is the objective is given. Mind you, the objective again is given by parliament, given by the people. They say that you go out there, do 4%. So then I'm doing that. That's task I'm doing. Then don't ask, no, why you didn't do something else. No. So that is the thing. But when I'm doing with multiple objectives, that it creates a lot of communication challenges. Your Professor Madhu was saying that he was trying to pick up, did some research work that looking at the central bank communication, saying the kind of messages that they're sending out. Is there a clarity of messages that we are sending out? It becomes all the more difficult. And risk to autonomy, I said. So autonomy is saying that you're getting autonomy from the government by separating out, keeping a distance, but now we are coming more closer to that. But, then the questions, there are several questions remain as you are youngsters. I said that I don't have answers, then I'll pose you with these questions. And now what I have not dealt with in detail because of time, that what is being unconventional monetary policy. What is unconventional monetary policy? What is a conventional monetary policy, you would ask? It is through interest rate tool that you do. That is how monetary policy is understood, that conventionally people do. If Federal Reserve Bank would have to respond to inflation, it would raise the Fed fund rate or reduce the Fed fund rate. Similarly, we'll do our repo rate and things like that. That's the conventional monetary policy. But if you're using quantitative tools, these are not conventional monetary policy. So now, because you see in the Western countries, the central banks have flexible inflation targeting objective, but they're doing a lot of unconventional monetary policy. So now the question arises, is it monetary policy that you are doing, or it is a macroprudential policy? That's an issue. And there are feedback effects, because these are not isolated compartments through which you can operate this policy. Because as I said, liquidity, credit, and risk-taking channels are very important, and hence you cannot have independent, say that I'm doing independent financial stability policy and independent monetary policy. So let me conclude. Financial stability turned a full circle now, okay? Because the central banks were born at the womb of crisis, because this crisis only gave rise to central banks. No central bank came because then monetary policy was not known. Central banks didn't come into existence because of monetary policy. They came because of the financial stability. Now the whole thing has turned a full circle. From financial stability to price stability, then again back to financial stability. And as I said that financial stability again is a shared responsibility, because too big a responsibility, because you are a different sector regulator. Because the literature coordination becomes an issue because everywhere. On theory, if you are writing a theoretical paper, then we say it's a coordination fine. SEBI chief, RBI chief, IRDA chief get together and they sit down, Ministry of Finance, Finance Secretary comes and they sit down in the board and discuss. And in practice, it's extremely difficult. How do you coordinate among peers? It's very difficult. As you would see that it's very difficult to coordinate. Coordination becomes extremely difficult. In theory, it may look simple, but in practice, it becomes extremely difficult. And monetary policy would have to be inflation-centric. Of course, financial stability an issue, because if, as I said, that as a central bank, if you're not able to maintain inflation in a low and stable framework, then obviously you lose credibility. And there is need for a lot of research in terms of macro-financial policy, because the way separately the finance guys who are doing finance, macroeconomists doing macroeconomics, growth, productivity, inflation, and what have you, and they were not talking to each other. So that was the problem. And all the models which have been built, that you see the workhorse model, that what we use for for monetary policy and all the DSG model and all that. So there is no finance into that. So now suddenly you have to rethink. You have to bring in finance into those models. So that was a neglected area. So where a lot of research need to be done. So let me end with two questions again. But now the question that, it is a central bank. So can financial stability objective override your price stability objective? There's a problem, but you have inflation. I don't know. And can policy interest rate really be used as an instrument for financial stability? Jury is still out, so it is not known. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, sir. The forum is now open for question and answers.
My name is Sindhur. I am from PGP1, first year. My question is about the PPI basket, the Producer Price Index basket. So we are predominantly a service economy these days. And so knowledge and experience become very important components in that. So how is that, is it a reasonable suggestion to try to include that in the basket also? There are very great challenges in that, in measurement. But if we do not include that, aren't we missing out on very important information for our economy?
No, I think it's a little different, because if you're saying the PPI, it's Producers Price Index. Okay, so that is mostly will take into account commodities. Okay, if it's a factory, a car, what does it cost at the factory gate? Got my point? So these are most commodities. So services really doesn't come into PPI. Our WPI is little close to PPI. Got my point? So that is it is a mix of both, producers' prices and consumer prices. But the important question is that it doesn't take into account services, isn't it? Because our economy is 60%, 60 to 65% is services industry, so it doesn't figure in PPI and WPI. So that is how we are going into the CPI. So consumer price index. So a lot of services come, because if you see that the weight of, say, fuel, it would be in double digits if you look at WPI. But the weight of fuel, if you go to CPI, it would be 2%. Then what happened to fuel? Because then fuel gets into transportation, which is the services. Price of that really goes up. So services is reflected in CPI. So obviously, as monetary policy, what you are trying to do, you are trying to control aggregate demand. Aggregate demand, as you know, has only three components. It's consumption, investment, and your external demand that you are doing. And bulk is consumption. And CPI is the right indicator for consumption, because people are looking at, if I look at WPI, I say that I draw a wrong conclusion, because it is in deflation. I should be sharply cutting interest rate. But the man in the street feels what is the price in the market, what they're paying for transportation, education, health, medical expenses and all that. So those prices are different. So CPI is the right indicator. And of course, we've been asking, please sit down, asking the government to have a pure measure of producer price index, which unfortunately we don't have, many countries have. But that is again in the domain of the government, because the Reserve Bank doesn't compile the price indicators, because there's a conflict of interest. Because suppose we are targeting inflation and we produce that inflation number, so credibility would not be there. So some other agency, it is the Central Statistical Office which produces that number. So your question that are we covering the services inflation adequately? Yes. If you take CPI as the indicator, we are covering the services component very well in that.
Good evening, sir. I'm Rahul from BKFS first year. I have actually two questions to ask you. You spoke about interest rates. China has been devaluing its currency right now. It's devalued to 2.5%. Rupee has also been depreciating to 65.5 levels right now. So do we see any forced devaluation in currency going forward to counter the Chinese devaluation? And my second question would be from the payment bank's perspective. RBI has recently granted 11 licenses to corporate houses. Actually, public sector banks have come up with statements saying that it's going to eat up the market share of many of the public sector banks and private sector banks. So what's the extent of effect that you see going forward towards the market share of these commercial banks?
Your first question, if I answer,
Yes.
by the time I reach Mumbai, I would have lost my job. Okay? So, exchange rate you don't know, because nobody really takes a call on exchange rate. But I can tell you the policy that exchange rate. We said that, okay, we have a flexible exchange rate. And the Reserve Bank steps in to manage volatility, because the excess volatility should not be there. Don't ask what you mean by excess volatility, how much SD, 1 SD, 2 SD, whatever it is there, standard deviation. So that is the exchange rate policy. So that, please sit down. So that policy has not really changed. Okay? And that's the first question. And of course, that you see there's a depreciating pressure, because if there's a capital flight from the country, obviously the currency comes under pressure, but it is again market determined, and if you see the volatility is very strong, that we do intervene in the process. But Indian rupee has depreciated less compared to the other currencies. And the other implied analytical question in what you asked, what is again called in the literature is a beggar-thy policy, that competitive devaluation. So that is a big risk which our governor himself is trying to sensitize the global economy, that you have aggregate demand is given. See, everybody trying to get price advantage by deliberately, if at all, I'm saying deliberately within quote, I don't mean by deliberate devaluation. So then where do you go? Got my point? So, which is not a good policy, so that everybody should not be really doing that. That's an analytical question. The other question means which side you are, because as students, if there are more products, more availability, you should be happy, isn't it? Because you have another option. There should be competition in the system. But having said that, I'm saying that because you guys are tech savvy, you have to do homework or assignment and things like that. Who will go and queue up in the bank? You have your smartphone and all that you do. The banking becomes easier. So as a consumer, why should you care if there are more providers, more competition, better facility? As citizens of this country, we should be happy. At the same time, let me not annoy my banking friends, because I would have to interact with them also. And there the issue is that on the payments bank has a limited turf. It cannot do credit. And these are small ticket deposits they're taking. They're not taking big ticket deposits. And this payments bank also can operate as business correspondent of other banks. So they could work as the agent of the other banks. And then they would help them to reach the last mile. Because we have asked the commercial bank that you have business correspondent go into remote villages and things like that, which they are struggling because they're not been able to successful. And if these banks come in, and with their wide reach of network and things like that, the mobile companies and all that, so commercial banks can use them and tap that. So it will improve services, it would improve competition in the system. For the economy as a whole, it would be, hopefully, it would be a good thing too. But it's too early to say. Then we would have to, because all these things cost money and investment, but you would have to see. And of course, the way that you would see that the license which has been given, one common thread is that some partnership with the technology companies. So that is being done, because most of the mobile companies have come in that process. And also, these are corporate houses with different kind of business model and experience. So once you don't know which one will work, then try various models. That something at least should work. So out of 11, at least 50% of them should give satisfactory services. Yeah.
Hello, sir. I'm Sriram from section PGP2. So my question is, recently the government came up with a draft version regarding the constitution of the Monetary Policy Committee, which says that out of the 7 members, the 4 members will be nominated by the government and the 3 from the RBI. It also proposed to take away the veto power which the governor currently enjoys. Do you think this move by the government will lower the autonomy of the RBI? And my second point is, given the political compulsions the government has, will it be effective if it becomes a rule in the future?
Yeah, please sit down. No, let me update you a little bit. So latest position is that the government and the Reserve Bank have amicably settle that issue. But it has not come into the public domain that what would be the exact composition of Monetary Policy Committee, because that needs amendment to our Act, Reserve Bank of India Act. So government will be coming out with that amendment. It is the government's jurisdiction. But I could tell you that amicably we have resolved that particular issue. Then I can be little theoretical here because I am among students, thinking aloud, not as a, if I take off my cap as a policymaker, then I would have to tell that you all, have a group dynamics, you all sit down and discuss and things like that. So would you like somebody with a veto power? That if you see Mr. Natarajan is breathing down your neck, your director, and telling that you people decide that whatever would be there, you will be trying to second guess that what he is going to do, and what is his mind, and what he likes, what he doesn't like. And if you don't like that, he will veto you. You can vote against him, but he will veto you. So, though FSLRC had recommended, so having somebody with a veto power in a committee goes against the basic principle that, say, wisdom of crowd. That you say if it is multiple people, more people, they give you a much better decision than what one single individual can do. That's the wisdom we get from here. Of course, that if you see even Security Council, somebody has a veto power, then you, because of that, so it is not majority voting. We have all kinds of problems there. But generally, if you're going for a Monetary Policy Committee, the idea should be their balance. So it should not be, this is my personal view, that you should not have somebody with veto power, then that is no different from a single person taking that kind of a decision. This is a theoretical answer, but the official answer and what is fact, that issue has been resolved. But in a democracy, it's a good thing that you to have a debate, discussion with the government and things like that and other stakeholders. And then you come out with the discussion, the ultimate solution, which is in the best interest of the country.
My name is Devalina and I'm from PGP second year. My question is with regards to microfinance institutions, or more specifically microcredit institutions, which aim at providing short-term loans. But the loans range from 1 lakhs to 3 lakhs with an average interest rate of payment of 30%, 40%. The increased farmer suicides are usually attributed to the inability to pay debt. So do you think microcredit institutions are actually being able to fulfill their purpose, or it is actually acting as something like counterintuitive to them? Thank you.
Yeah, because you have a lot of questions rolled into one, because then I need a full lecture to explain that what is happening there. Because it's again risk profile. Your interest rate would have to be seen against your risk profile, isn't it? Because something could be very high risk that you are doing. Because if you go normally a formal financial institution bank, you would be priced out because you would not be there in that system. So there could be high risk, but there could be productive activity. Because what is the alternative they have? That you say somebody that a street cart vendor, goes to the supplier or money lender, takes a street cart, borrows 1,000 rupees, buys the provisions and all that, and returns 1,100 rupees. He or she is very happy and doing a business profitable. Compound that, it's a daily setting, it is not annual rate, at a huge interest rate. With that also, that activity is also viable. He's not defaulting on that. Mostly, some people may default and things like that. They work out in that kind of a business model. No, see what I'm trying to drive at, that it is possible that if you're doing high risk, your alternative is go to money lender, that is the interest rate is even higher, you come to microfinance and you do that, but there are problems because this process can be misused. So no longer it is 30-40% in that sense, that following Malegaon committee, that because there was a gap in terms of credit, there is a section, unorganized sector, poor people, they wanted money. Banks could not really service those small ticket borrowers and all that. So Reserve Bank was a little more relaxed in that situation. We said as long as you are not taking deposit, so we are not coming into the play, into regulating you, give credit and things like that. But that was again taken to the other extreme if you are talking about Andhra Pradesh.